Hi guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the darkest and most misunderstood corners of medieval Europe. A world where whispered promises carried more weight than royal decrees, and a single hidden blade could change the fate of an entire kingdom. History often remembers kings, queens, and great battles. But hidden behind every crown was a quieter story, one filled with secret meetings, silent footsteps, and people whose names were never meant to be remembered. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these relaxing journeys through history. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy seeing people joining from different parts of the world. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, perhaps let the gentle sound of a fan become part of the evening, and together, let's drift back nearly 800 years. The truth is, almost nobody chose to become an assassin because they wanted adventure. No child in a medieval village dreamed of growing up to hide in alleyways with a knife tucked beneath a worn cloak. It wasn't a respected profession. It wasn't even considered a real profession. It was simply one of the many desperate choices left to people who had already lost almost everything. The medieval world could be unbelievably harsh. A failed harvest meant hunger. A sickness could wipe out an entire family. One lost battle could leave thousands of soldiers wandering the countryside with no home, no money, and no future. For some, survival became more important than honor. And when survival is all that matters, even the impossible can begin to feel reasonable. Imagine waking before sunrise in a village where the air smelled of damp earth, smoke, and livestock. Your home was a small wooden hut with a leaking roof, and breakfast, if there was any at all, might be nothing more than stale bread and watered ale. Most people never traveled farther than the nearest market town, and every day looked almost exactly like the one before it. Life offered very few chances to escape poverty. If you were born a peasant, you were expected to remain one until the day you died. Heavy taxes, endless labor, and the constant fear of famine shaped every season. Even a good harvest could disappear after a noble collected his share or an army marched through the countryside. Then there were the wars. Kings and lords fought over borders, castles, and family claims that ordinary people barely understood. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and young men were pulled into conflicts that promised glory but usually delivered only hunger and grief. Those lucky enough to survive often returned home with permanent injuries, worn-out weapons, and nowhere to belong. Some drifted from town to town searching for work. Others became caravan guards, hunters, or laborers. But a few discovered that the skills they had learned in war, moving quietly, watching patiently, and striking at exactly the right moment, could be worth far more than honest work ever paid. It rarely happened overnight. There was no official recruitment, no secret school hidden high in the mountains, and certainly no glamorous ceremony. Instead, it usually began with a rumor, a quiet conversation in a crowded tavern, or a stranger asking if someone was willing to solve a difficult problem, for the right amount of silver. The meeting almost never took place inside a grand castle. It happened in places where ordinary people blended into the crowd. A noisy tavern filled with merchants. A stable behind an inn. A lonely roadside chapel. Somewhere that a quiet conversation could disappear beneath the sounds of everyday life. The person offering the job rarely looked like a villain. He might dress like a traveling trader, a minor clerk, or even a servant delivering supplies. He avoided giving his real name, and he certainly didn't reveal who had sent him. In medieval Europe, secrets could be worth more than gold. The conversation was usually short. A small leather pouch would be placed on the table. Inside were a few silver coins, sometimes only half the payment. The rest would come later, if the task was completed. Then came the name. It might belong to a wealthy merchant who had made dangerous enemies. A knight caught in a bitter family feud. A local official accused of corruption. Or a noble whose growing power had begun to worry someone even more powerful. There were no long speeches about justice or honor. Those words were for public ceremonies. Behind closed doors, politics often became far quieter and far more dangerous. Removing a single person could end a conflict without raising an army, or begin an even larger one. For the person listening, saying yes meant stepping into a world with almost no way back. Refusing was usually safer. But hunger has a way of making impossible decisions feel surprisingly reasonable. And once that first coin purse was accepted, every shadow in the city seemed just a little darker than before. Accepting the job was only the beginning. The real challenge wasn't carrying a weapon, it was learning patience. Unlike the stories told in modern movies, medieval assassins rarely charged through castle gates with swords drawn. That would have been suicide. Instead, they spent days, sometimes even weeks, simply watching. They learned when the target woke each morning, which church he visited, which road he preferred on market days, which guards stayed alert, and which ones grew careless after a few cups of ale. Every tiny detail mattered. A successful assassin understood that routine was often stronger than stone walls. Even the most powerful lord followed habits without realizing it. He might pause every afternoon to admire his horses, pray at the same chapel, or walk through the castle garden just before sunset. Those predictable moments became opportunities. Watching, however, was exhausting. It meant standing for hours in the rain, pretending to be a traveler, a laborer, or a merchant with nowhere important to go. It meant eating little, sleeping lightly, and never drawing attention. One careless glance could ruin everything. Cities in medieval Europe were surprisingly crowded. Narrow streets twisted between timber houses, blacksmiths hammered metal from dawn until dusk, and market squares buzzed with merchants shouting over one another. It was the perfect place to disappear, if you knew how. But it was also the perfect place to be noticed. One suspicious guard, one curious child, or one neighbor who remembered seeing the same stranger too many times could bring the entire plan crashing down. In a world without cameras or fingerprints, people relied on memory. And sometimes, memory was more dangerous than any weapon. Choosing a weapon was rarely about strength. It was about silence. A heavy battlefield sword looked impressive, but it was awkward in narrow streets and impossible to hide beneath ordinary clothing. Most assassins preferred smaller weapons that could disappear under a cloak without attracting attention. A sharp dagger was often the first choice. It was simple, easy to carry, and useful for far more than fighting. To everyone else, it looked like an ordinary tool. To the person carrying it, it might decide whether they lived long enough to see another sunrise. Not every plan depended on a blade. Throughout medieval Europe, poison carried a fearful reputation. Wealthy nobles worried constantly about what was poured into their cups or mixed into their meals. Stories spread of mysterious illnesses that appeared overnight, although many deaths blamed on poison were probably caused by disease instead. Even so, fear itself became a powerful weapon. Servants were watched. Cooks were questioned. Wine was sometimes tasted by another person before reaching the Lord's table. The more powerful someone became, the less they trusted the food placed before them. Yet the greatest weapon wasn't steel or poison. It was surprise. An attack lasted only a few heartbeats, but preparing for it could take weeks. Every movement had to be planned. Every escape route memorized. Every possible mistake imagined before it happened. Because once the first move was made, there would be no second chance. If the attempt failed, castle bells would ring, gates would slam shut, horses would thunder through the streets, and every guard in the region would begin searching for one frightened figure trying to disappear into a medieval world that suddenly felt far too small. Escaping was often far more difficult than carrying out the attack. The moment word spread that an important person had been killed, the entire town could change within minutes. Castle gates were locked. Bridges were guarded. Travelers were questioned. Anyone with muddy boots, torn clothing, or an unfamiliar face suddenly became suspicious. There was no fast horse waiting around the corner, and certainly no secret tunnel leading to freedom. Most assassins escaped on foot, blending into the same frightened crowds that had gathered to hear the shocking news. Sometimes they threw away their cloak and exchanged it for rough peasant clothing. Others shaved their beard, covered their hair, or pretended to be a tired pilgrim on a holy journey. A simple change in appearance could mean the difference between freedom and capture. But disappearing wasn't easy in medieval Europe. Villages were small. Inns remembered their guests. Ferry operators noticed strangers. A traveler who asked too many questions or carried too many silver coins could quickly attract unwanted attention. Then there were the rewards. If the victim had been wealthy or powerful, notices spread from town to town promising generous payment for information. A poor farmer who had never seen a single gold coin in his life suddenly had a reason to pay close attention to unfamiliar faces. Trust became almost impossible. The person offering a warm meal might truly be kind, or might be waiting for the local sheriff. A friendly traveler could become a loyal companion, or someone hoping to collect the reward by morning. For many assassins, the hardest part of the job wasn't the killing itself. It was spending the rest of their lives wondering whether the next knock on the door would be an ordinary visitor, or the men who had finally caught up with them. Even if an assassin escaped, peace rarely followed. Every sunrise brought a new reason to look over one's shoulder. Every unfamiliar face at a marketplace seemed to linger a little too long. Every rider approaching on a lonely road could be carrying a message, or a warrant for arrest. Life became a constant exercise in caution. Few people knew their real names. Many abandoned the places where they were born, leaving behind family, childhood friends, and the villages they would never see again. The fewer people who recognized them, the better their chances of surviving another year. Some drifted between growing medieval cities, where crowded streets made it easier to disappear. Others hid in forests, crossed mountain passes, or followed merchant caravans from one kingdom to another. Medieval Europe was divided into countless lordships and kingdoms, each with its own rulers and laws. Crossing a border could sometimes mean escaping justice, at least for a little while. But running carried its own hardships. Money disappeared quickly. A handful of silver coins that once seemed like a fortune could vanish after paying for food, horses, clothing, and safe places to sleep. Before long, another mysterious stranger might appear with another offer, another pouch of coins, and another dangerous name. That was the trap. One job became two. Two became five. Eventually, survival depended not on farming, trading, or honest work, but on accepting ever greater risks. Few escaped that cycle. The medieval world had little mercy for people living in the shadows. And the longer someone remained there, the harder it became to imagine a life in the light once again. Not every assassin worked alone. Although history often paints the image of a solitary figure slipping silently through the darkness, many dangerous missions depended on the help of others. Information was just as valuable as a sharp blade, and someone always seemed willing to sell a secret for the right price. A stable boy might notice which horse a noble preferred to ride. A kitchen servant could quietly mention when an important guest would arrive for dinner. An innkeeper might overhear a conversation between traveling knights who believed no one was listening. Most of these people never considered themselves part of a murder plot. They simply needed money. Life in medieval Europe was expensive for ordinary people. A poor harvest, a sick child, or unpaid taxes could push an entire family toward ruin. A few silver coins offered by a stranger often looked like an answer to desperate prayers. Of course, information could flow in both directions. Just as an assassin searched for weaknesses, nobles searched for rumors. Castles employed loyal servants, trusted guards, and messengers whose only job was to listen. Whispers traveled surprisingly fast through medieval towns, and an unusual question asked in the wrong tavern could reach the ears of a lord before sunset. That is why experienced assassins spoke very little. They avoided asking direct questions, rarely revealed their true purpose, and trusted almost no one. Every conversation carried a risk. Every new acquaintance might secretly be working for someone else. In a world built on rumors and loyalty, the deadliest weapon was often not the knife hidden beneath a cloak. It was a single careless word spoken to the wrong person. Sooner or later, nearly every assassin faced the same terrifying question. What happens if the target knows you're coming? Powerful nobles were rarely as careless as stories suggest. Many had survived years of political rivalries, family feuds, and failed betrayals. They understood that wealth attracted enemies just as surely as honey attracted flies. Some hired additional guards. Others changed their daily routines without warning. A few even spread false rumors about where they would travel, hoping to lure their enemies into carefully prepared traps. An assassin who relied on old information could walk straight into disaster. Imagine arriving at a quiet country road where a noble was supposed to ride alone, only to discover 20 mounted guards waiting in complete silence. The hunter could become the hunted in a matter of seconds. Capture was a fate few wanted to imagine. Medieval justice was harsh, especially when the victim was important. Interrogations were designed to uncover names, employers, and conspirators. Confessions were often demanded, whether they were true or not. Those accused of political murder could spend their final days in dark prison cells, uncertain whether sunrise would ever come again. Because of this, many assassins prepared an escape before they planned the attack itself. They memorized hidden paths through forests, quiet river crossings, abandoned mills, and lonely monasteries where a weary traveler might rest without attracting attention. Every journey had at least two possible endings: success, or desperate flight. And perhaps the strangest part of all was this. The people who hired assassins often feared them just as much as they needed them. After all, someone willing to kill for silver today, might accept a larger bag of silver tomorrow. In time, stories about assassins grew far larger than the people themselves. Around crackling fires, travelers whispered tales of silent killers who could climb castle walls without making a sound, disappear into the fog like ghosts, or strike from impossible distances. Each retelling added another impossible detail, until fact and legend became almost impossible to separate. The truth was usually much less dramatic. Most assassins were ordinary people carrying extraordinary fear. They became cold, wet, hungry, and exhausted like everyone else. Their plans failed. Their hands shook. Their courage disappeared at the worst possible moments. Behind every successful attack were countless abandoned plans that never left the imagination. Medieval life itself encouraged these legends. Without newspapers or reliable records, rumors traveled faster than facts. A mysterious death could quickly become a tale of poison, hidden daggers, secret societies, or curses sent by powerful enemies. By the time the story reached the next kingdom, almost nothing remained of the original truth. Kings and nobles sometimes welcomed these rumors. If people believed an invisible network of assassins served the crown, fear alone could discourage rebellion. Enemies who imagined danger everywhere often made mistakes without a single blade ever being drawn. Yet fear worked both ways. An assassin who earned a frightening reputation could never truly relax. Every stranger might recognize the stories. Every suspicious glance could mean someone believed the rumors were real. In the end, the greatest prison wasn't built from stone walls or iron bars. It was a life where trust disappeared completely, and every new dawn began with the same silent question. Who already knows who I am? As the years passed, many of those who had once lived by the blade simply disappeared from history. They left behind no grand castles, no heroic statues, and almost no written records. Chroniclers preferred to write about kings, queens, and victorious generals. The people who moved through the shadows were mentioned only briefly, if they were mentioned at all. Sometimes a single sentence was all that remained. A certain man was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Or perhaps, the Lord never reached the city, and no one discovered who was responsible. For historians, these small fragments are both fascinating and frustrating. They hint at hidden stories but rarely reveal the full truth. Was it an accident? A robbery? A political conspiracy? Or the work of someone whose name was intentionally erased? We'll probably never know. What we do know is that medieval Europe was a world where power was fragile. A kingdom could change because of one unexpected death. A family dynasty could end in a single evening. A treaty might collapse simply because one important person never arrived at the negotiating table. In that uncertain world, fear became almost as powerful as armies. People locked their doors earlier. Nobles surrounded themselves with loyal guards. Servants were watched more carefully than before. Invitations to banquets were accepted with caution, and even a friendly cup of wine could inspire suspicion. Ironically, the assassin's greatest achievement was often the attack that never happened. If fear forced a powerful ruler to change his decisions, avoid certain roads, or distrust dangerous allies, then the mission had already succeeded without a single weapon ever leaving its hiding place. Eventually, the medieval world began to change. Kingdoms grew stronger, cities became larger, and rulers slowly built more organized systems of law. Permanent guards replaced temporary militias, official courts gained greater authority, and traveling across the countryside became slightly less chaotic than it had been centuries before. None of this happened overnight. For generations, violence still lingered in the shadows. Political rivals continued to scheme, ambitious nobles still plotted against one another, and secret killings did not simply disappear. But the age of the wandering assassin, surviving from one dangerous contract to the next, gradually became less common. History moved forward. New weapons appeared. New governments formed. The great stone castles that had once seemed impossible to conquer slowly lost their military importance. Even the methods of eliminating political enemies changed with the times. Yet something never changed. Human ambition remained exactly the same. Power continued to tempt people. Greed still inspired betrayal. Revenge remained a force capable of destroying families, friendships, and entire kingdoms. The faces changed, the clothes changed, and the centuries passed, but human nature stayed remarkably familiar. Perhaps that's why these stories still capture our imagination today. Not because we admire the people who lived in the shadows, but because they remind us how fragile peace can be when fear, desperation, and ambition take control. And as our quiet journey through medieval Europe comes to an end, it's worth remembering one final thought. Most assassins never became legends. They became forgotten. Their names vanished, their footsteps faded, and the silence they once depended upon eventually swallowed them completely, leaving behind only whispers for history to remember. As the centuries passed, the stories of these shadowy figures slowly transformed into legend. Traveling storytellers exaggerated every tale they heard. A man who slipped through an unlocked gate became someone who could climb sheer castle walls with his bare hands. A carefully planned escape became a miraculous disappearance into thin air. Before long, the truth had become almost impossible to separate from fiction. People loved these stories because they explained the unexplainable. When a powerful lord died unexpectedly, it was comforting, or perhaps terrifying, to believe that a mysterious assassin had been responsible. It was often easier than accepting that illness, betrayal by a trusted friend, or simple bad luck could bring even the strongest ruler to an end. The legends grew with every generation. Some claimed there were secret brotherhoods hidden deep in the mountains, training silent killers from childhood. Others believed certain assassins could blend into any crowd, speaking dozens of languages and changing their identities whenever they wished. History tells a quieter story. Most of these tales have little evidence behind them. Real medieval assassins, when they existed, were usually ordinary people living extraordinary lives under impossible circumstances. They relied on patience, planning, and luck, not magical skills or supernatural abilities. Perhaps that is what makes the real history so much more interesting. It reminds us that history is rarely shaped only by famous kings and celebrated heroes. Sometimes it turns because of forgotten people whose names were never written into the great chronicles. And tonight, as the candles burn low and the castles of medieval Europe slowly fade into the darkness once more, we leave behind a world of whispered secrets, uncertain loyalties, and silent footsteps, a world that still echoes through history, even after all these centuries. May your evening be peaceful, your dreams be gentle. Among all the stories told about medieval assassins, few were as famous as the tales of secret killers sent after kings and powerful rulers. Whether every detail was true hardly mattered. What mattered was that people believed such things could happen. Imagine being a king in the 13th century. You sleep behind thick stone walls. Guards patrol the corridors all night. Heavy wooden doors are locked from the inside. Armed men stand watch at every gate. From the outside, it seems impossible for anyone to reach you. Yet fear still follows you to bed. Because the danger might already be inside. A trusted servant could be bribed. A messenger might carry more than letters. A guest at a banquet could arrive with hidden intentions. The greatest threat was often not the stranger outside the castle, but the familiar face already walking its halls. This fear shaped daily life for many rulers. Meals were carefully prepared and closely watched. Visitors were questioned. Guards were chosen not only for strength, but for loyalty. Some rulers even changed sleeping chambers regularly so that very few people knew exactly where they would spend the night. Even then, certainty remained impossible. The medieval world lacked modern security systems. There were no cameras, no electronic locks, and no instant communication between distant cities. Information traveled slowly, often arriving days or weeks after an event had already occurred. As a result, rumors flourished. One kingdom might hear that a ruler had died from illness. Another might insist he had been poisoned. A third would claim a secret assassin had slipped through the castle during a stormy night. The truth often disappeared beneath layers of speculation. And perhaps that uncertainty was the most frightening thing of all. Because if nobody knew exactly how a powerful ruler died, then nobody knew how to stop it from happening again. One of the greatest misconceptions about medieval assassins is that every mission ended with a dramatic confrontation. In reality, the most successful attacks were often the quietest ones. No clashing swords. No desperate chase through castle corridors. No final speech before the fatal blow. Instead, the goal was usually to leave before anyone realized something had gone wrong. Imagine a crowded market on a cool autumn morning. Merchants call out their prices, horses pull heavy wagons through muddy streets, and children weave between stalls chasing one another. Hundreds of people fill the square, each focused on their own business. It is the perfect place to become invisible. An assassin could walk among pilgrims, traders, monks, and laborers without attracting attention. Everyone wore simple wool clothing, dusty boots, and weathered cloaks. Unless someone looked closely, one stranger appeared much like any other. That ordinary appearance became the greatest disguise. Sometimes the target never noticed danger approaching. A brief conversation. A handshake. A shoulder brushing through a crowded street. Then the mysterious stranger simply continued walking while the crowd swallowed them once again. By the time confusion spread, the attacker could already be several streets away, blending into another marketplace or joining a caravan leaving the city gates. Of course, reality was rarely so perfect. Plans failed for countless reasons. A guard arrived early. A horse refused to stay quiet. A curious child noticed someone acting strangely. Or sudden rain emptied the streets, leaving nowhere to hide. The medieval world was unpredictable, and even the smallest unexpected event could destroy weeks of careful preparation. That is why patience mattered more than bravery. An experienced assassin knew that waiting another day was often wiser than forcing a dangerous opportunity. After all, surviving to try again was far more valuable than becoming. The journey itself could be more dangerous than the mission. Long before an assassin reached a castle, a monastery, or a wealthy merchant's home, they first had to survive the roads of medieval Europe. Those roads were nothing like the smooth highways we know today. Most were little more than muddy tracks winding through forests, fields, and lonely hills. After heavy rain, wagons became trapped in thick mud, and travelers often walked for miles beside exhausted horses. Nights were even worse. There were no streetlights, no welcoming rest stops, and certainly no emergency help if something went wrong. Once darkness settled across the countryside, the world became almost silent except for the wind moving through the trees, the distant howl of wolves, or the creaking of old wooden carts struggling along rough paths. Most travelers avoided moving after sunset. Bandits watched the roads, waiting for merchants carrying silver or pilgrims returning from distant shrines. A lone traveler was an easy target, especially if he appeared nervous or tried too hard to avoid conversation. For someone carrying a secret mission, every stop at an inn brought another risk. The innkeeper might remember their face. Another guest might ask too many questions. A drunk soldier might insist on sharing a table. Even something as ordinary as signing a travel record or mentioning the wrong hometown could create problems later. So many chose to speak as little as possible. They listened more than they talked, paid their bill without complaint, and left before sunrise while most people were still asleep. In a world where strangers were always noticed, becoming forgettable was perhaps the greatest skill of all. Sometimes the safest person wasn't the strongest fighter. It was simply the traveler nobody remembered seeing. By the time an assassin reached the town surrounding a castle, the real work was only beginning. Rushing toward the target was almost guaranteed to end in failure. Instead, the first few days were spent doing something that looked incredibly ordinary. They wandered through busy markets, visited blacksmith shops, watched farmers unload carts, and quietly observed the rhythm of daily life. Every town had its own routine. The castle gates opened shortly after sunrise. Merchants arrived with fresh bread, vegetables, barrels of ale, and firewood. Messengers rode in carrying letters sealed with colored wax, while servants hurried between the town and the castle with baskets and supplies. An outsider who paid close attention could learn a surprising amount without asking a single question. Which gate was busiest? Which guard seemed lazy? When did the evening watch change? Who entered the castle without being searched? These small details often mattered more than any weapon. Sometimes the easiest way inside wasn't climbing a wall at all. It was walking through the front gate carrying a sack of flour, a bundle of firewood, or a cart filled with vegetables. Castles depended on a constant flow of workers and supplies, and familiar faces were rarely questioned. Of course, pretending to belong required confidence. One nervous glance, one uncertain answer, or one step in the wrong direction could attract unwanted attention. Medieval guards didn't have modern technology, but they understood human behavior remarkably well. They noticed people who looked uncomfortable, avoided eye contact, or seemed too interested in places they had no reason to visit. So patience remained the greatest weapon. Sometimes the perfect opportunity appeared after only a few days. Other times, it took weeks before a single careless mistake by the target opened a door that had seemed impossible to unlock. Even the strongest castles had one weakness. They depended on people. Stone walls could stop an invading army, but they could not prepare meals, clean hallways, feed horses, or deliver messages. Every day, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of servants, laborers, blacksmiths, cooks, stable hands, and merchants passed through the castle gates. Each person represented a small opportunity. A cook knew when the lord preferred to eat. A stable boy knew which horse would be saddled before dawn. A chambermaid noticed which room the noble slept in after a late-night meeting. None of them were spies by profession, but together they held countless pieces of valuable information. Most never realized how important those details could become. An experienced assassin understood that knowledge was collected one tiny piece at a time. A conversation overheard in a bakery. A delivery wagon arriving every Thursday. A guard who always slipped away for a mug of ale just before sunset. On their own, these details meant almost nothing. Together, they formed a complete picture. Still, nothing was certain. A single unexpected visitor could change the day's routine. Heavy rain might delay a delivery. A lord could suddenly leave the castle for a hunting trip, forcing weeks of careful planning to begin all over again. That was the reality of life in the shadows. Success did not belong to the fastest or the strongest. It belonged to the person willing to wait, and wait, until the perfect moment finally appeared. Waiting was often the hardest part of the entire mission. An assassin might spend 10 days preparing for a moment that lasted less than 10 seconds. During that time, nothing exciting happened. There were no dramatic battles or daring escapes, only long hours of watching, remembering, and resisting the urge to act too soon. Every morning began the same way. the market slowly came to life. Bakers opened their ovens before sunrise, filling the streets with the smell of fresh bread. Blacksmiths struck glowing iron with steady rhythm, while merchants arranged fruit, cloth, and pottery outside their shops. Hidden among them was someone who appeared completely ordinary. Perhaps a traveler warming his hands by a fire. Perhaps a merchant pretending to inspect leather goods. Perhaps a pilgrim quietly resting after a long journey. No one gave the stranger a second glance. That was exactly the point. Drawing attention, even for a few seconds, could ruin everything. A guard might remember a face. A shopkeeper might recall an unusual question. Days later, those small memories could become valuable clues. So the safest choice was often to do nothing. To sit patiently. To observe quietly. To become another unnoticed face in a crowded town. History celebrates dramatic moments, but real life rarely works that way. Many successful plans were built not on courage, but on endless patience. And in medieval Europe, patience was often the sharpest weapon anyone could carry. Part 21. Sooner or later, every carefully planned mission reached the same moment. The opportunity finally arrived. Perhaps the Lord decided to ride outside the castle with only a few guards. Perhaps he stayed longer than usual at the village church. Or maybe he dismissed his soldiers after a long feast, believing the night to be perfectly safe. For days, nothing had changed. Then, in a single morning, everything did. The assassin could not afford excitement. A racing heart led to careless mistakes. Shaking hands made simple tasks difficult. Every movement had to appear calm, almost effortless, even while the mind raced through dozens of possibilities. What if another guard appeared? What if the target changed direction? What if someone recognized a familiar face? Every plan contained an escape route, but no plan survived reality exactly as expected. Sometimes the best decision was to walk away. That sounds surprising, yet many dangerous missions ended without anyone being harmed. If the situation felt wrong, experienced assassins often disappeared into the crowd and waited for another chance rather than risking certain capture. Survival always came first. There was little reward in completing a mission if it ended with arrest before sunset. So they waited. They watched. And when the perfect moment refused to appear, they accepted another day of silence. Because in the medieval world, one careless second could destroy weeks of preparation, while one extra day of patience might make the impossible suddenly seem easy. When the moment finally came, it passed almost faster than anyone could understand. There were no cheering crowds. No heroic music. No dramatic speeches. Only a few quick heartbeats that could change the course of a family's future, or even the history of a kingdom. If everything went according to plan, confusion followed almost immediately. People shouted in surprise. Guards rushed in every direction, each believing someone else knew what had happened. Horses neighed, doors slammed shut, and the quiet routine of the town vanished within seconds. In moments like these, panic became an invisible ally. While everyone searched for the attacker, they often searched in the wrong place. Some guards raced toward the castle gates. Others questioned merchants or travelers. A few chased the first suspicious person they saw, even if that person had nothing to do with the event. Meanwhile, the real assassin's greatest goal was not speed. It was calm. Running attracted attention. Looking frightened invited questions. The safest escape often looked surprisingly ordinary. A person carrying a basket of vegetables. A traveler leading a tired horse. A monk walking quietly toward the monastery before sunset. In a crowded medieval town, people noticed unusual behavior far more than familiar faces. That simple truth saved more lives than any sword ever could. For those who survived, the mission was not truly over. The longest journey still lay ahead. The journey home, where every road, every inn, and every stranger might already know that somewhere nearby, a powerful man had just met an unexpected end. The road away from the town was rarely peaceful. News traveled surprisingly fast in the medieval world. A rider carrying an urgent message could reach the next village before sunset, and by the following morning, rumors often spread farther than the truth itself. People loved to speculate. Some claimed a foreign spy had been responsible. Others insisted it was the work of a rival noble seeking revenge. A few whispered that dark forces had cursed the victim. Very few imagined that the person responsible might be quietly walking along the same road, looking no different from every other traveler. That was the greatest advantage. Ordinary people were almost invisible. A dusty cloak, worn leather boots, and a small pack over one shoulder described thousands of travelers crossing Europe every single day. Unless someone had a reason to look closely, one face blended easily into another. Even so, danger never disappeared. At every bridge, a guard might ask simple questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you going? What business brings you here? The answers had to sound natural. Too much detail created suspicion. Too little invited even more questions. Experienced travelers understood this well. They answered politely, smiled when appropriate, and continued on their way without appearing rushed. By nightfall, they searched for a quiet place to rest. Not the busiest inn. Not the most expensive one. Just somewhere forgettable. Because the safest journey was often the one that nobody remembered the next morning. The road away from the town was rarely peaceful. News traveled surprisingly fast in the medieval world. A rider carrying an urgent message could reach the next village before sunset, and by the following morning, rumors often spread farther than the truth itself. People loved to speculate. Some claimed a foreign spy had been responsible. Others insisted it was the work of a rival noble seeking revenge. A few whispered that dark forces had cursed the victim. Very few imagined that the person responsible might be quietly walking along the same road, looking no different from every other traveler. That was the greatest advantage. Ordinary people were almost invisible. A dusty cloak, worn leather boots, and a small pack over one shoulder described thousands of travelers crossing Europe every single day. Unless someone had a reason to look closely, one face blended easily into another. Even so, danger never disappeared. At every bridge, a guard might ask simple questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you going? What business brings you here? The answers had to sound natural. Too much detail created suspicion. Too little invited even more questions. Experienced travelers understood this well. They answered politely, smiled when appropriate, and continued on their way without appearing rushed. By nightfall, they searched for a quiet place to rest. Not the busiest inn. Not the most expensive one. Just somewhere forgettable. Because the safest journey was often the one that nobody remembered the next morning. After several days on the road, the greatest enemy was no longer the guards. It was exhaustion. Walking for hours beneath the summer sun or through freezing winter rain slowly drained every bit of strength. Boots wore thin against rough stone roads. Cloaks became heavy with mud, and a simple meal of bread and cheese could feel like a feast after days of travel. Sleep never came easily. Every sound outside the inn, a horse stopping in the yard, a door opening, footsteps in the hallway, could pull a traveler awake. Was it another guest arriving late, or someone searching every room? The uncertainty was impossible to escape. Even in peaceful villages, strangers attracted attention. Children stared with curiosity. Old men asked where the traveler had come from. Innkeepers politely wondered how long their guest planned to stay. Most questions were harmless. People were simply curious. But someone living with dangerous secrets could never be completely certain. So they learned to become forgettable. They helped carry firewood, thanked the innkeeper for the meal, paid their bill without complaint, and left quietly before sunrise. It was an ordinary routine. And that was exactly what kept them alive. Because in medieval Europe, surviving often depended less on fighting skill and more on convincing everyone around you that there was absolutely nothing worth remembering about the person who had just passed through town. With every mile, the mission grew farther behind. The castle became a distant shape on the horizon. The frightened voices, the ringing bells, and the hurried footsteps slowly faded into memory. Yet the mind refused to let them go. Many nights were restless. Sitting beside a small campfire beneath the open sky, a traveler had little to distract them from their thoughts. The crackling flames, the cool evening breeze, and the endless stars above offered a strange kind of silence. It was in those quiet moments that doubt often appeared. Had the risk been worth it? Would the promised reward ever arrive? Or had the person who offered the job already decided that one witness was too many? Trust was a dangerous luxury. Those who hired assassins rarely valued loyalty. They valued results. Once the task was finished, the person carrying it out sometimes became an inconvenience rather than an ally. History contains many stories of promises that were never kept. Some returned expecting a heavy purse filled with silver, only to find empty hands and closed doors. Others discovered that the people who had employed them had vanished, leaving no names, no addresses, and no way to demand payment. The medieval world could be remarkably cruel. A person might survive impossible dangers only to lose everything because of betrayal. Perhaps that is why so many old tales end not with celebration, but with another lonely traveler disappearing into the mist, still searching for a place where they could finally stop looking over their shoulder. As the seasons changed, the roads of medieval Europe changed with them. Spring covered the countryside with green fields and blooming wildflowers, but it also turned dirt roads into thick rivers of mud. Every wagon sank deeper into the ground, and every traveler found the journey slower than expected. Summer brought longer days. The forests echoed with birdsong, farmers worked from sunrise until dusk, and merchants filled the highways with carts carrying grain, wool, and barrels of ale. Crowded roads made it easier to disappear among strangers, but they also meant more eyes watching every passerby. Then came autumn. Golden leaves drifted through the cool air, and villages hurried to gather food before winter arrived. Smoke rose from chimneys as families prepared for the cold months ahead. Travelers were welcomed a little more warmly, knowing that no one wanted to spend a freezing night outdoors. Winter, however, was a different story. Snow buried the narrow paths, rivers froze, and icy winds swept across empty fields. Some mountain passes became impossible to cross, forcing travelers to wait for weeks in unfamiliar towns. For anyone carrying dangerous secrets, winter could feel like a prison. Moving too slowly risked being recognized. Moving too quickly risked freezing to death. Nature itself became another obstacle. Unlike the legends, medieval life was rarely a series of exciting adventures. More often, it was a quiet struggle against cold, hunger, fatigue, and uncertainty. And for many who lived in the shadows, surviving the weather was sometimes harder than surviving their enemies. Not every danger came from armed guards or suspicious nobles. Sometimes, the greatest threat was simple conversation. Medieval inns were more than places to eat and sleep. They were the information centers of their age. Merchants exchanged news from distant cities, pilgrims shared stories from holy shrines, soldiers boasted about recent battles, and wandering minstrels entertained anyone willing to listen. If you wanted to know what was happening across a kingdom, you visited an inn. For someone carrying dangerous secrets, that made every evening a careful balancing act. Sitting alone for too long invited curious questions. Joining every conversation could reveal too much. The safest choice was often to listen more than speak. It was remarkable how much people revealed without realizing it. A merchant might casually mention that the king's tax collectors were expected next week. A blacksmith could complain that extra horseshoes had been ordered for the castle guard. A traveler might mention seeing soldiers gathering near a distant bridge. Each small detail seemed unimportant on its own. Together, they painted a picture of the world beyond the next hill. At the same time, rumors spread just as easily. A single careless sentence could travel farther than the person who first spoke it. By the following morning, an innocent remark might become a completely different story after passing through half a dozen conversations. That is why experienced travelers chose their words carefully. They smiled. They nodded. They laughed at the right moments. But they rarely revealed more than necessary. Because in medieval Europe, a secret was often safest when it remained inside the mind of the person carrying it. For many travelers, the sight of a monastery brought a quiet sense of relief. Hidden among forests, perched on lonely hills, or standing beside peaceful rivers, monasteries offered something that was surprisingly rare in medieval Europe: safety. Monks welcomed pilgrims, merchants, and weary travelers, asking for little more than respectful behavior and, when possible, a small donation. The atmosphere was very different from the noise of crowded towns. Stone corridors echoed with soft footsteps. Candles flickered in silent chapels. Bells marked the passing hours, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from simple kitchens where monks prepared modest meals. For someone living in the shadows, such places offered a brief chance to breathe. No one expected long conversations. No one questioned a traveler who wished to spend the evening in quiet reflection. Still, appearances could be deceiving. Monasteries often received visitors from every corner of Europe. Pilgrims carried stories from distant kingdoms. Messengers delivered sealed letters. Noble families sometimes stopped during long journeys, bringing news that had not yet reached nearby towns. Listening carefully could reveal far more than asking direct questions. A single passing remark about a royal wedding, an approaching army, or a change in local leadership might explain why roads had suddenly become crowded or why extra guards watched the nearby bridges. By sunrise, the monastery returned to its peaceful routine. The traveler gathered a small pack, thanked the monks for their kindness, and continued down another winding road. Behind them, the bells rang gently through the morning air. Ahead lay another uncertain journey, another unfamiliar village, and another day in a world where every mile brought new stories, and new risks. Not every castle looked the same. Some stood proudly on steep rocky cliffs, where the only road climbed in slow, winding circles toward massive wooden gates. Others rose from quiet valleys, surrounded by farms, rivers, and small villages that depended on the protection of the local lord. Each fortress had its own strengths. High towers offered clear views for miles in every direction. Thick stone walls discouraged attackers, while deep moats forced enemies to think twice before moving any closer. At first glance, these castles seemed impossible to enter without an army. But daily life still had to continue. Every morning, wagons carrying grain, firewood, meat, and fresh vegetables rolled through the gates. Blacksmiths arrived to repair horseshoes and armor. Messengers delivered letters from distant kingdoms, while craftsmen entered to fix broken roofs, doors, and furniture. A castle could not survive by shutting itself off from the outside world. It depended on a steady flow of ordinary people. That constant movement created small moments of distraction. Guards checked carts, greeted familiar workers, and managed long lines of visitors waiting to enter. Most days were peaceful, and routine slowly replaced caution. Human nature rarely changes. When people repeat the same task every day, they begin to expect everything to remain the same. That expectation could become a weakness. An unfamiliar face might pass unnoticed simply because everyone assumed someone else had already asked the necessary questions. Of course, no castle was ever truly easy to enter. One suspicious guard, one alert gatekeeper, or one loyal servant paying close attention could bring an entire plan to an immediate end. Sometimes, the strongest defense was not the towering walls. It was the careful eyes of the people standing behind them. Inside the castle walls, life followed a rhythm that rarely changed. Before sunrise, servants were already awake, lighting fires in the kitchens and carrying buckets of water from the well. Bakers prepared fresh bread, while cooks worked over steaming pots that would feed dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people before the day was over. The courtyard slowly filled with activity. Stable hands brushed horses and cleaned the stalls. Blacksmiths repaired broken tools and sharpened swords worn from training. Guards gathered for the morning watch, receiving instructions before taking their positions along the walls and gates. To an outsider, it looked like controlled chaos. But to someone who observed carefully, it was a predictable pattern. The same workers appeared at nearly the same time each day. The same guards exchanged shifts. The same wagons entered through the main gate. Routine created order, but it also created habits. And habits were easier to study than people realized. Some guards chatted with friends instead of watching the road. Others hurried through inspections on cold mornings, eager to warm themselves by the fire. A few became so familiar with local merchants that they barely glanced at their wagons anymore. None of these actions seemed dangerous. They were simply the result of doing the same work every single day. Yet history has often shown that great events begin with very ordinary moments. A gate left open a little too long. A distracted guard. A visitor who appeared perfectly harmless. Tiny details, almost invisible at the time, could quietly shape the fate of castles, kingdoms, and the people who lived within their walls. Beyond the walls of castles and cities, another world existed. A world of forests, lonely roads, and small villages where news arrived slowly and life followed the rhythm of nature. For many people in medieval Europe, the forest was both a place of danger and a place of freedom. Travelers feared entering deep woods after sunset. The thick trees blocked the moonlight. Narrow paths disappeared beneath fallen leaves, and every unfamiliar sound created uncertainty. A broken branch, footsteps behind them, or movement between the trees could make even a brave traveler reach for a weapon. Yet forests also offered something valuable. Privacy. People who wanted to avoid attention often traveled through wooded areas rather than crowded roads. Hidden paths connected villages that few outsiders knew existed. Small clearings provided places to rest away from busy towns. But survival there required knowledge. A person needed to understand which plants could be eaten, where clean water could be found, and how to stay warm during cold nights. Without those skills, the forest could become more dangerous than any enemy. Hunters, foresters, and local villagers knew these lands better than anyone. They understood the sounds of animals, the changing weather, and the safest routes through difficult terrain. For a stranger, however, the forest was unpredictable. One wrong turn could add days to a journey. One storm could leave someone cold and exhausted. And one encounter with the wrong group of travelers could create problems far worse than getting lost. In the medieval world, every environment had its own challenges. Castles had guards. Cities had rumors. Roads had dangers. And forests had secrets hidden beneath the trees. While castles and forests created their own challenges, medieval cities were perhaps the easiest places to disappear. Unlike small villages where everyone knew each other's names, cities were crowded, noisy, and constantly changing. Merchants arrived from distant lands, travelers searched for work, and thousands of people moved through narrow streets every day. The sounds never truly stopped. Carpenters hammered wood. Blacksmiths struck hot metal. Market sellers called out their prices. Horses and carts moved through muddy streets while people hurried between shops, churches, and homes. For someone who wanted to avoid attention, this constant movement could be useful. A person could walk through a marketplace in the morning and become just another face among hundreds. They could rent a small room, buy simple clothing, and create a new identity far away from where they were known. But cities had their own dangers. Crowds created opportunities for hiding, but they also created opportunities for mistakes. A stranger asking unusual questions could attract attention. A person spending too much money could make people curious. A traveler who changed their story too often might find others quietly comparing what they had said. Medieval cities were filled with observers. Shopkeepers watched customers. Neighbors noticed unusual activity. Guild members protected their businesses. Even people who seemed uninterested often knew more about their surroundings than outsiders expected. Living unnoticed required balance. Too much attention was dangerous. But completely disappearing could also create suspicion. The most successful travelers learned to become ordinary. They worked when work was available. They spoke when conversation was expected. They laughed when others laughed. They became part of the background. Because in a crowded medieval city, the safest person was often not the one who hid the best. It was the one nobody had a reason to re. The medieval world was built on reputation. A person's name could open doors, or close them forever. For nobles, reputation meant power. A respected lord could gather allies, command soldiers, and influence important decisions. For merchants, a good reputation meant customers trusted their goods and their promises. But for people living in the shadows, reputation was dangerous. A name that became too famous attracted attention. Stories traveled from town to town about skilled fighters, clever thieves, and mysterious figures who seemed to appear and disappear without explanation. Some people gained fearsome reputations without ever wanting them. And once a legend began, it was almost impossible to control. A small event could become a much larger story after passing through many voices. A narrow escape became a tale of impossible skill. A lucky moment became proof that someone possessed extraordinary abilities. The truth often became less important than the story. This created a strange problem. Being unknown offered safety. But being known offered opportunities. A person with a frightening reputation might receive more offers and more money. Yet every new story made it harder to disappear completely. Eventually, someone would recognize the name. Someone would remember a face. Someone would connect the rumors to the person standing in front of them. That was the hidden cost of living by fear. The same reputation that created power could eventually become a prison. And in the quiet corners of medieval Europe, many people discovered that the hardest thing to escape was not a castle wall, a guard patrol, or a locked door. It was the story that followed them wherever they went. For those who lived dangerous lives, the greatest challenge was often not the enemy in front of them. It was the weight they carried inside. Medieval society was deeply connected to faith, tradition, and ideas of right and wrong. Churches stood at the center of many communities, and people were constantly reminded that every action had consequences beyond this world. For someone who spent their life in secrecy, this created a difficult conflict. The money might solve a temporary problem. The mission might remove a powerful enemy. But afterward, there was always the silence. There were no crowds celebrating. No songs praising their actions. Only the memory of what had happened and the uncertainty of what would come next. Some people tried to leave that life behind. They changed their names, moved to distant regions, or searched for honest work. A few entered religious communities, hoping that a quiet life of prayer and service could replace years spent in darkness. Others were unable to escape. The skills they had developed became the only way they knew how to survive. A person who had learned to live by secrets often found ordinary life strangely difficult. Trusting others. Building friendships. Sleeping peacefully. These simple things could become the hardest challenges of all. Because a life spent watching every shadow changes a person. And sometimes, even after leaving the dangerous roads behind, the mind continues walking them. The passing of time slowly changed the medieval world. The old ways of warfare began to transform. Kingdoms became more organized, rulers created stronger systems of control, and information traveled faster between important cities. The world that once allowed small groups and secret figures to operate in the shadows began to become more connected. But change came slowly. For many years, the same fears remained. Powerful people still worried about betrayal. Families still fought over wealth and influence. Rivals still searched for ways to weaken their enemies without starting open wars. The difference was that the world around them was becoming harder to disappear in. Growing cities meant more records. Stronger governments meant more officials. Better communication meant news traveled farther and faster. A person who once could vanish into another region now faced a world where their actions were more likely to follow them. The shadows were becoming smaller. The mysterious figures who once moved between kingdoms began to lose their place. Their old methods became less effective, and rulers found new ways to protect themselves and punish those who threatened them. Eventually, the legendary image of the medieval assassin became something from the past. But the stories remained. They survived in books, rumors, and the imagination of later generations. People continued to wonder about those forgotten figures who walked through medieval streets carrying secrets that could change history. Were they monsters? Were they victims of their circumstances? Or were they simply people shaped by a harsh world that gave them very few choices? Perhaps the truth was somewhere between all of these things. As the old world slowly faded, the stories of medieval assassins became surrounded by mystery. Later generations looked back at those centuries and imagined a world of hidden passages, secret societies, and impossible missions. Writers created dramatic tales where every shadow contained danger and every castle hallway held a forgotten secret. But the real medieval world was much quieter. Most days were not filled with battles or conspiracies. Most people simply worked, traded, raised families, prayed, and tried to survive another winter. The rare moments of violence stood out because everyday life was usually much more ordinary. That contrast is what made these stories so powerful. A peaceful village could suddenly become the center of a political struggle. A simple messenger could carry information that changed the fate of a kingdom. A person who nobody noticed could influence events that were remembered for centuries. History is often shaped by unexpected people. Not always kings wearing crowns. Not always generals leading armies. Sometimes by forgotten individuals standing at the edge of society, making choices in difficult circumstances. The names of most medieval assassins disappeared with time. Their homes vanished. Their voices were lost. Their personal stories were buried beneath hundreds of years of history. But their existence reminds us of something important. The past was not only created by famous figures whose statues stand in city squares. It was also shaped by countless unknown people whose lives were hidden in the background. And sometimes, the quietest stories are the ones that leave the deepest shadows. When we imagine medieval castles today, we often picture grand halls, shining armor, and noble celebrations. But behind those impressive walls was a reality filled with caution. A castle was not only a home. It was a place where power was protected. Every doorway, every staircase, and every narrow passage carried a purpose. Thick walls defended against armies, but inside, careful routines defended against something more difficult to predict: human betrayal. Guards were not only watching the outside world. They were watching the people who entered and left every day. A servant carrying food. A messenger delivering letters. A visitor requesting an audience. Everyone had a reason for being there, and everyone represented a small amount of risk. Trust was necessary, but complete trust could be dangerous. A ruler needed servants to survive, advisors to make decisions, and soldiers to protect the castle. Yet history repeatedly showed that danger sometimes came from the closest circles. Friends could become rivals. Allies could become enemies. A trusted person could hold the most valuable information of all. That is why many powerful figures lived carefully. They listened closely. They questioned often. They remembered small details. To them, survival was not only about strength. It was about understanding people. Because a castle could have the strongest walls in the kingdom. But the most dangerous doors were often the ones opened by trust. Beyond the stories of assassins and nobles was another important group of people, the messengers. In medieval Europe, information was power. A message from one kingdom to another could decide whether armies marched, alliances formed, or peace continued. Before modern communication existed, a single letter carried by a writer could change the future of thousands of people. Messengers traveled through the same dangerous roads as everyone else. They crossed forests, rivers, and mountains. They faced storms, thieves, and exhaustion. A journey that takes only hours today could require many days or even weeks. Because of this, messengers were often trusted with important secrets. A sealed letter might contain military plans. A royal message might announce a political decision. A simple piece of paper could carry information worth more than gold. That made messengers valuable targets. Stopping a message could sometimes be just as important as confronting the person who sent it. If information disappeared, decisions could be delayed, alliances could weaken, and enemies could gain an advantage. But messengers also had their own skills. They learned which roads were safest, which villages offered shelter, which bridges could be crossed during difficult weather. Many knew the countryside better than soldiers because their lives depended on constant travel. In a world without instant communication, the person carrying the message was often as important as the message itself. And sometimes, the fate of a kingdom rested on whether one tired traveler reached the next castle before nightfall. While powerful rulers worried about hidden enemies, ordinary people faced a different kind of struggle. For most medieval villagers, life was not about politics or secret plots. It was about survival. A farmer woke before sunrise to work the fields. A blacksmith spent long hours shaping tools and weapons. A baker prepared bread that would feed an entire neighborhood. Every person had a role, and every role mattered. These ordinary lives created the world where legends were born. A traveler searching for information needed places to rest. A messenger needed roads and villages along the way. A person hiding from danger needed crowded streets where they could become invisible. Without ordinary people, the hidden world of medieval politics could not exist. The market seller who remembered a stranger's face. The innkeeper who heard travelers talking. The farmer who noticed unfamiliar riders passing through the village. Small observations from ordinary people could sometimes become important pieces of a much larger story. Yet most of these people never knew the importance of what they saw. They simply continued their daily lives, unaware that kings, nobles, and powerful families were making decisions that could affect entire regions. History often focuses on those who held power. But behind every great event were thousands of unnamed people who carried messages, grew food, built roads, and kept society moving. Their names may have disappeared. But without them, the world of medieval Europe would never have existed. As the night settled over medieval towns, a different world appeared. During the day, streets were filled with merchants, workers, and travelers. But after sunset, the atmosphere changed completely. The narrow roads became quiet, the market stalls closed, and the warm glow of candles replaced the bright movement of daylight. Night belonged to those who knew how to move through silence. Guards walked along walls carrying lanterns. Watchmen called out the passing hours. Dogs protected homes and alerted people to anything unusual. A simple sound in the darkness could make an entire household wake in fear. For most people, night meant staying indoors. Doors were locked. Fires were kept burning. Families gathered together until morning arrived. But for others, darkness offered opportunities that daylight could not. A crowded street made it easy to disappear, but an empty street made it easier to avoid being seen. Shadows covered movement, and the quiet of the night could hide footsteps. Still, darkness was not always an advantage. The same shadows that hid one person could hide another. A person walking alone after midnight never knew who might be watching from an alley or behind a closed doorway. That uncertainty shaped medieval life. People feared what they could not see. They listened carefully. They moved cautiously. And they understood that the night carried its own mysteries. When the first light of dawn finally appeared, the town slowly returned to life. Bakers opened their doors, merchants prepared their goods, and people returned to their daily routines. But the secrets of the night remained hidden, waiting for history to uncover them centuries later. One of the most powerful forces in medieval society was loyalty. Kings depended on loyal knights. Nobles depended on trusted servants. Families depended on each other during difficult times. Without loyalty, the entire structure of medieval life could begin to collapse. But loyalty was not always simple. A person could be loyal to their family but against their ruler. A soldier could follow orders while secretly questioning them. A servant could feel grateful to a lord while still struggling with personal needs. Human decisions were rarely as clear as stories made them seem. For those living in dangerous worlds, loyalty became something to measure carefully. Who could be trusted? Who might change sides? Who was speaking honestly? These questions mattered because information was often more valuable than weapons. A loyal friend could save a life. A false friend could destroy one. This uncertainty affected everyone, from the poorest traveler to the most powerful ruler. Even kings surrounded by gold and armies understood that power alone could not guarantee safety. They needed people. And people were unpredictable. Perhaps that was the greatest lesson of medieval politics. Stone walls could be rebuilt. Weapons could be replaced. But once trust was broken, repairing it was far more difficult. In a world filled with secrets and rivalries, the strongest protection was often not a sword or a castle. It was knowing who would stand beside you when everything began to fall apart. As centuries passed, the memory of medieval assassins slowly became mixed with imagination. People who lived long after those events often looked back and saw a world full of mystery. Ancient castles, forgotten roads, and old manuscripts created the perfect setting for legends to grow. But behind every legend was a human story. The people who lived during those times experienced the same emotions we understand today. Fear. Hope. Greed. Regret. The desire for a better life. They were not characters in a story. They were real people making decisions in a difficult world. Some wanted wealth. Some wanted revenge. Some were simply trying to survive another day. Understanding this helps us see history differently. The medieval period was not only about battles and powerful rulers. It was also about ordinary choices made by ordinary people. A single decision could change a person's entire future. Accept a dangerous offer, and life could become a constant escape. Refuse it, and hunger might remain. There were rarely easy answers. That is why the stories continue to interest us. They are not only about weapons or secrets. They are about human nature. About what people are willing to do when they feel they have no other path. And perhaps that is the most timeless part of the story. The world has changed greatly since medieval times. But the struggles between ambition, fear, survival, and morality remain familiar even today. As the medieval age moved toward its later centuries, the world around these shadowy figures continued to transform. Cities expanded. Trade routes became busier. Governments grew stronger. The simple methods that once allowed people to disappear between kingdoms became more difficult to use. Records became more common. Officials paid closer attention. Communities became more connected. A person could no longer vanish as easily as before. The same roads that once provided escape now carried more information than ever. A rumor that once took months to travel could now spread much faster between towns and regions. For those who depended on secrecy, this was a major change. The shadows were becoming smaller. The world was becoming more organized. But even as old methods disappeared, the reasons behind conflict remained. People still wanted power. Families still fought for influence. Rulers still feared betrayal. The tools changed, but human ambition stayed the same. Eventually, the legendary medieval assassin became less of a living reality and more of a story from the past. Their footsteps faded from the roads. Their hidden meetings disappeared. Their names were forgotten. Yet the questions they leave behind remain interesting. What choices would a person make when every other option seemed impossible? How far could desperation push someone? And how would history remember those who lived outside the ordinary world? Perhaps the answer is simple. History remembers the powerful. But it often wonders about the forgotten. The final centuries of the medieval world brought even greater changes. New ideas spread across Europe. Cities became centers of learning and trade. Powerful kingdoms created more organized armies and stronger systems of law. The old world of isolated castles and distant villages slowly began to transform. For people who lived in the shadows, this meant a different kind of challenge. The world was becoming harder to hide in. A stranger arriving in a small village might once have disappeared without questions. But as cities grew and governments became stronger, information became easier to collect. Names were recorded. Travel was monitored more carefully. Officials began paying closer attention to unusual events. The age of mystery was slowly giving way to the age of documentation. But even then, secrets never completely disappeared. Behind royal courts and wealthy households, people still whispered about rivals and enemies. Ambition still created conflicts. Powerful individuals still searched for ways to protect their positions. The difference was that the methods changed. The medieval assassin of legend became less common, replaced by new forms of political influence and hidden struggles. The world moved forward. But the lessons of the past remained. A person with power could still fall. A secret could still change history. And even the strongest rulers were still human. They could build enormous castles, command armies, and control vast lands. But they could never completely control the thoughts and actions of the people around them. Looking back through the pages of history, it is easy to imagine medieval Europe as a world of heroes and villains. But the truth was much more complicated. The people who lived during those centuries were not simply good or evil. They were shaped by their surroundings, their struggles, and the limited choices available to them. A person born into wealth had opportunities that others could never imagine. A person born into poverty often spent their entire life fighting for basic survival. The same world that created great rulers also created desperate individuals who searched for any possible way forward. This does not erase responsibility. Actions still had consequences. Choices still affected the lives of others. But understanding the past requires looking beyond simple stories. Every forgotten figure had a background. A childhood. A family. A reason they became the person history later remembered, or forgot. Some may have believed they were solving problems. Others may have only wanted to escape hunger and hardship. Some may have regretted their choices. Others may never have looked back. We can never know every hidden thought from hundreds of years ago. But we can learn from the world they left behind. Because history is not only about what happened. It is about understanding why people made the choices they made. And sometimes, the quietest stories reveal the deepest truths about humanity. As our journey through medieval shadows slowly moves toward its end, we return to the places where these stories began. The castles still stand in ruins across Europe. The old roads still cross the countryside. The forests still whisper with the wind. But the people who once walked those paths are gone. The guards who watched the gates. The merchants who carried news between towns. The travelers who searched for safety. The forgotten figures who lived dangerous lives. All of them eventually became part of history. Time has a way of removing the details. Names disappear. Voices become silent. Buildings fall apart. But the choices people made continue to leave traces behind. A single decision could change a family. A single betrayal could change a kingdom. A single moment could become a story remembered for centuries. That is why studying the past is so fascinating. We are not only looking at old battles or ancient rulers. We are looking at human beings. People who felt fear. People who wanted something better. People who struggled with impossible choices. The medieval world was harsh, but it was also filled with ordinary moments of kindness, courage, and survival. And somewhere between the great castles and forgotten roads were thousands of stories that were never written down. Stories of people who lived, struggled, and disappeared into time. Perhaps the greatest mystery of history is not what we know, but how much has been lost forever. The world of medieval assassins was never as simple as the legend suggested. Behind every whispered story was a complicated reality. There were no perfect villains or unstoppable warriors. There were only people living in a difficult time, making choices that were sometimes desperate, sometimes selfish, and sometimes impossible to understand. The shadows they lived in were not only the dark streets or hidden rooms. The real shadows were fear, uncertainty, and the constant struggle to survive. Many dreamed of leaving that life behind. They wanted quiet homes, peaceful mornings, and ordinary days where they did not need to watch every person who walked past them. But escaping a dangerous reputation was never easy. A person could change their clothing. They could travel to a distant land. They could use a different name. Yet the memories of the past often followed them. The medieval world had little understanding of second chances. A mistake could define someone forever. A single rumor could destroy a person's future. That is why many people who lived in secrecy remained trapped by their own choices. The path into darkness was easy to enter. But finding a way back was far more difficult. And perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden inside these old stories. Power and fear may seem strong for a moment, but they rarely create a peaceful life. In the end, even those who moved through the darkest corners of history were still searching for the same things everyone wants. Safety. Freedom. And a place where they could finally rest. As the last chapters of the medieval world unfolded, the old stories slowly became memories. The castles that once echoed with footsteps became quiet ruins. The roads that carried merchants, soldiers, and travelers became paths for historians and visitors searching for pieces of the past. The people who once lived through those uncertain times could never have imagined that centuries later, others would still wonder about their lives. They were not thinking about becoming legends. They were simply trying to survive. A farmer wanted a good harvest. A merchant wanted a safe journey. A soldier wanted to return home. And those who lived in the shadows wanted something just as simple, a chance to see another sunrise. History often remembers the final events. The battles. The deaths. The victories. But behind every ending were countless smaller moments that shaped the story. A conversation in a quiet tavern. A decision made on a lonely road. A secret shared between two people. These small moments created the world that later generations would study. Perhaps that is why forgotten stories matter. They remind us that history was not created only by famous names written in gold letters. It was created by ordinary people whose lives were never recorded. People who laughed. People who suffered. People who hoped. And even though their names have disappeared, their experiences still echo through time. Because every person who lived in the past was once someone looking toward the future, just like we do today. Now, as we approach the end of our journey, the medieval world slowly fades into the distance. The sound of horses on stone roads becomes quieter. The voices inside crowded taverns disappear. The flickering candlelight inside ancient castles grows dim. What remains are only the stories. Stories of ambition. Stories of fear. Stories of people who walked through uncertain times and made choices that shaped their own lives and the lives of others. The medieval assassin became a symbol of mystery because they represented something people have always feared, the unknown. A hidden enemy. A secret plan. A danger that could appear without warning. But behind that symbol were real human beings. They were not ghosts. They were not legends. They were people who woke up each morning, felt hunger, felt fear, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Some found themselves trapped by circumstances. Some made choices they later regretted. Some disappeared completely, leaving behind nothing but rumors. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of their story. Not that they lived in darkness, but that many of them were forgotten by it. Their footsteps vanished from the roads. Their voices disappeared from history. Their names faded away. Yet their stories remain because they reveal something timeless about humanity. The desire to survive. The search for power. The struggle between right and wrong. These things existed hundreds of years ago, and they still exist today. And now, as the final chapter approaches, we leave behind the shadows of medieval Europe and prepare to close this quiet journey through one of history's most mysterious worlds. Hi guys, tonight we travel back through the forgotten roads of medieval Europe and stepped into a world of secrets, danger, and hidden struggles. We walked through quiet villages, entered the great stone castles, followed lonely travelers across ancient roads, and looked into the lives of those who lived far away from the spotlight of history. The world of medieval assassins was not the glamorous adventure that stories often show. It was a world of uncertainty. A world where one decision could change everything. Where a person could gain silver but lose peace. Where a successful mission did not always mean a successful life. Behind every legend was a human story. A person who had fears. A person who had dreams. A person who was shaped by the harsh reality of their time. Today, their names may be forgotten, but their stories still remind us that history is not only made by kings and armies. It is also made by the unknown people walking quietly in the background. The choices of ordinary individuals can sometimes create extraordinary consequences. So as the candles burn lower and the sounds of the medieval world slowly disappear, we leave behind the shadows of castles and ancient streets. The old roads become silent. The forgotten voices fade away. And the past returns to the pages of history. Thank you for joining this journey tonight. If you enjoyed this peaceful walk through history, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more stories from the forgotten corners of the past. Until our next journey together. Sleep well.